Personally, I enjoyed the DCEU more than most. However, it was very scattershot. There were so many behind-the-scenes issues and constant production problems. A reboot was 100% the correct decision. And this rebooted DC universe gets its theatrical introduction with the brand new Superman film by James Gunn. Welcome to the Summer of Superman, and hopefully you can join me on this journey through Superman's theatrical roller coaster ride. And yes, the theatrical roller coaster ride does come to an end this weekend. However, the Summer of Superman will continue with animated movies, video games, and some weird, obscure Superman projects you might not have heard about. However, if that's not your jam, still stick around, because after the Summer of Superman, we will all have a fantastic fall. But let's not waste any more time, and let's get into James Gunn's Superman. After years and years of a Man of Steel 2 being in production hell, and like every other canceled Superman project, seemingly had Brainiac as its main villain. However, even though there are a lot of films within the DCEU that I genuinely love, it was still a huge-ass mess. And James Gunn is a proven, successful comic book movie director who has genuine love and respect for the source material, making him the perfect fit to jumpstart this new DC universe. Originally, James Gunn turned down the idea of directing and making a Superman film and decided to go with the Suicide Squad instead. Eventually, though, he came around on the idea and decided to make his very own Superman film, taking inspiration from beloved comic book storylines like All-Star Superman, Superman Birthright, A Superman for All Seasons, etc., as well as other properties like Superman the Animated Series and Justice League Unlimited. Onto the casting, Gunn wanted a Superman that is somebody you want to give a hug, a wholesome, genuinely kind person. After watching the movie Pearl, Gunn decided that David Corenswet will be his Superman. David Corenswet does an immaculate job playing both Superman and Clark Kent. One of my minor issues with Man of Steel is the lack thereof of Clark Kent and the lack of the dynamic between Clark and Superman. In James Gunn's Superman, you also don't really have a whole lot of Clark Kent. He's really only in like one, maybe 1.5 scenes. However, that one scene with Clark Kent in the Daily Planet is all I needed to see the performance, to see the nuances, to see the transition from Clark Kent to Superman, and for David Corenswet to show his versatility in the role. Jacob Elordi, Patrick Schwarzenegger, and a couple others were also considered for the role, but even when you look at the behind-the-scenes footage of David Corenswet interacting with the children extras and seeing the look on those children's faces, he truly gives off the aura of Superman. Emma Mackey, Rachel Brosnahan, Samara Weaving, and Phoebe Dynevor all tested for Lois Lane, and the eventual winner would go to the marvelous Mrs. Maisel herself, Rachel Brosnahan. She does an amazing job playing Lois Lane. She's probably tied for me for the best theatrical Lois Lane with Margot Kidder. However, personally, my go-tos, my Lois Lanes have all been on television, whether it's Terry Hatcher, Erica Durance, or even Elizabeth Tulloch. However, with more projects for Rachel Brosnahan to shine in, she could easily overtake all three of those. Nicolas Hoult, who was second in line to play Batman in the Matt Reeves film, was cast as Lex Luthor. However, he actually auditioned for the role of Superman. Lex Luthor is one of the elements I'm more mixed on, however, it has nothing to do with the performance. I think Nicolas Hoult is by far the best theatrical Lex Luthor we have seen yet. That being said, much like Lois Lane, my personal Lex Luthor is on television with Michael Rosenbaum, and will probably always be Michael Rosenbaum. You also have Eddie Gathegi, I hope I pronounced that right, as Mr. Terrific, who is an obscure character that I loved growing up. I discovered Mr. Terrific through this giant DC Comics encyclopedia that I had as a kid and thought he looked so cool, and so it inspired me to go check out some of his stories. And I'm so happy to be able to see the character brought to life on the big screen and given such a great spotlight and such a great portrayal and adaptation. You have Anthony Carrigan as Metamorpho, or the Element Man as they refer to him here. He has both two different names in the comics, but it's the same character. Once again, this is actually a character that I discovered as a kid through that giant DC Comics encyclopedia that I thought this character was awesome. And I fell in love with him through storylines involving the Outsiders in Batman, the Brave, and the Bold. And Anthony Carrigan actually played an extremely similar character in the CW's The Flash, known as The Mist. He also played Victor Zsasz in Gotham. Nathan Fillion is no stranger to nerdy movies. We nerds love him. He played Green Lantern. He voiced Hal Jordan Green Lantern in an animated movie that I genuinely love, and he's a perfect fit for Guy Gardner. That being said, Guy Gardner has never been my favorite Green Lantern. He's actually always been one of my least favorite Green Lanterns. I was not interested in seeing a Guy Gardner in this movie, to be honest, but it is a Guy Gardner. It's a very accurate portrayal of Guy Gardner as being the sarcastic asshole that still ends up doing the right thing in the end. Personally, I really do not want this to be the main Green Lantern that we get in this universe. I think he works really well as sort of an introduction to the Green Lanterns, but personally, I would rather them eventually focus on a Jon Stewart or a Kyle Rayner character. Isabela Merced shows up as Hawk Girl. She's great. She doesn't really get a whole lot to work with, though. She's just kind of there. That being said, she does very much feel like a live-action version of the Hawk Girl you see in the Justice League cartoon. You also get Wendell Pierce as Perry White, Mikaela Hoover as Cat Grant, and oh my god, I need to take someone off of my celebrity list.
Yeah, well, Missy, you better be glad that list is laminated.
Skyler Gisondo as Jimmy Olsen, and very briefly, you get Bradley Cooper as Jor-El, plus a bunch of other characters, and I was a little worried about it feeling overstuffed, but it never did. It handled all of these characters fairly well. On to the story. Because this just came out, I'm not going to go too far into specifics and too far into spoiler territory. The plot of the movie is essentially about Lex Luthor trying to kill and defeat Superman in a very episodic fashion. Sometimes it's a bad thing for a movie to feel episodic, however, it fits perfectly within this film. It helps you to understand that this is a lived-in world where spectacular things happen on a weekly basis and sometimes even a daily basis. There is a plot revolving around a Middle East dictator trying to invade a neighboring country. There are certainly some parallels you could probably draw between this film and some real-life current political issues involving the Middle East. However, keep in mind that is almost entirely a coincidence. This story was written 2 to 3 years ago, long before any of the events that happened this spring, and it's about fictional countries that don't actually exist. If there's anything political about this movie, in my opinion, it would be commentary on fake news and biased journalism, shown through the lines that Lois Lane says during her interview with Superman. There is also a side story involving Jimmy Olsen and Eve Tessmacher that I was not entirely expecting. Without further ado, let's get into my personal review and thoughts. I absolutely adored this film. It is the closest thing I've ever seen to a live-action comic book, apart from maybe Alex Ross artwork. It truly feels like the cartoons I watched growing up have been brought to life. It feels like the DeCamu animated films I watched in middle school and high school have been brought to life. It truly and unapologetically is a comic book movie. That being said, I don't think it's the best comic book movie ever made. The story isn't the deepest out there, but it doesn't need to be. Superman at his core is about giving humanity hope in situations where hope can be hard to come by. Superman is at his best when he is simply a Midwestern Boy Scout that just wants to do good. He sees the good in everybody and naively trusts almost everybody, even Lex Luthor. This Lex Luthor is a quintessential, non-redeemable character. However, Superman still sees good in him. In the final battle sequence and speeches, he states that one day he hopes Lex can get past the envy and jealousy and become a human again. At this current point in time, I don't really have any negatives for this film, but I do have some mixed elements that could become negatives depending on how well they sit with me over time. And one of those elements is Lex Luthor. But like I said during the casting, it's not the performance. It's how Lex is written, because I don't like the imprisoned Lex Luthor criminal mastermind anymore. I'm a little over it. Don't get me wrong, this movie does have public figure Lex, who the public respects. But you don't get it a whole lot, and the majority of the movie is spent with maniacally insane Lex in the control room. I'm also mixed about the public finding out about Lex's evil doing in the first movie. I kind of wish we could get to sit on it for a while, with Lex controlling villains and events in other movies behind the scenes while keeping a respectable public image. Two other elements I'm mixed on are both sets of parents. The twist they gave to Jor-El and Lara in terms of their motivations in sending Kal-El to Earth is probably the closest thing in this movie to being a negative for me. I don't really like the direction that it went, and it does sort of shift the whole plot of the movie when it is revealed. But at the same time, it still feels like a minor, small element to the movie, especially because by the end of the movie, I was having so much fun and I completely forgot that there was this element that I didn't initially enjoy. And then on to Ma and Pa Kent. First, I don't like the choice to just refer to them in the credits as Ma and Pa Kent. They're Jonathan and Martha. Initially, when you are first introduced to them, they are so much of a caricature of a Midwestern hick. I was born and raised in a small Nebraska town only a couple hours away from Kansas. I can get very picky when it comes to small, rural Midwestern depictions of characters. And at first, when you're introduced to them, they reminded me so much of the Ma and Pa Kent from the George Reeves's The Adventures of Superman, the first episode in that show. Not Superman and the Mole Men movie, but the first official episode. That is my least favorite version of Ma and Pa Kent, is that George Reeves version. And they reminded me a lot of that in their introduction scene early on in the movie. However, when you actually get to see them interacting with Clark on the farm in Smallville, it turns them around, and by the end of the movie, I really enjoyed their characters. Another element I'm sort of mixed on is Jimmy Olsen and Eve Tessmacher. This part of the review will get slightly spoilery. I weirdly enjoy the fact that Jimmy Olsen is a nerdy ladies' man. You know, he's not necessarily a ladies' man himself, but he's an attractive, nerdy guy that the ladies fawn over. And I actually do really enjoy adding that element to the Jimmy Olsen character. However, the way he treats Eve Tessmacher can sometimes feel very manipulative and at times a little misogynistic. There's a moment where Eve is sending information to Jimmy to take down Lex, and she is terrified for her life. Lex has imprisoned all of his ex-girlfriends, so she's afraid that she's gonna get imprisoned into this pocket universe, or maybe even Lex does something far worse to her. Meanwhile, Jimmy's just kind of selfishly debating whether he should go on a date with her or not, while she's terrified for her life and in a life or death situation. and it never really feels like he goes and attempts to actually try and save her from this abusive relationship with Lex. It just feels like he's using her for information. But by the end of the movie, I think it overall ends up working out. Jimmy has a legitimate smile on his face after Eve is freed. I just don't know yet if I fully enjoyed the journey to get to Jimmy and Eve at the end. Like I said, at this point in time, I don't really have too many negatives for this film, just a few elements that I'm mixed on. So obviously, I'm going to give 2025 Superman by James Gunn a thumbs up. I even gave it 5 stars on Letterboxd walking out of the theater. That being said, having slept on it, I would probably give it more of a 4.5 stars. It's not the greatest comic book movie ever made. It's not even the best DC movie ever made. And I actually prefer Zack Snyder's Justice League over this. The movie, not necessarily the universe. However, it is a great live-action cartoon with some adult humor thrown in to prevent it from feeling like a children's movie. So if you are an adult who grew up watching early 2000s cartoons like Justice League Unlimited, The Batman, Crypto the Superdog, Batman the Brave and the Bold, Teen Titans, and Young Justice like I did, then you will have an absolute blast with this film. Thanks for watching this video on James Gunn's Superman, and be sure to leave your thoughts in the comment section down below. Hit that subscribe button and notification bell so you can join the summer of Superman as we move on to animated movies, as well as some more obscure Superman properties that you might not have heard of that are actually pretty fucking weird. And eventually we'll move on to have a fantastic fall. But be sure to hit that like button if you enjoyed this video, and always stay super.